The air buzzed with the restless energy of a busy airport terminal. A symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and muffled announcements echoing through the cavernous space. Flight 739 to Aspen was moments away from boarding, and the gate thrummed with the nervous anticipation of travelers eager to escape to snowy peaks or cozy cabins. Amid this controlled chaos, Ava Robinson stepped forward, her heels striking the polished tile with a crisp, deliberate rhythm that turned heads. She was a vision of elegance, her navy suit tailored to perfection, accentuating her statuesque frame, while her leather handbag swung gently at her side, a subtle testament to her refined taste. A silk scarf, a cherished gift from her husband David, draped around her neck, its soft hues catching the harsh fluorescent light. With a practiced smile, she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, her demeanor unshakable, exuding the quiet confidence of a woman who had earned her place in the world. The young gate agent, barely out of his teens, hesitated as he took the pass, his fingers trembling slightly. His eyes flicked nervously toward the towering figure nearby, Captain Matthew Blake, the pilot in charge of the flight. Blake leaned against the counter with an air of casual dominance, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set in a way that screamed authority. His uniform was pristine, the gold stripes on his sleeves gleaming. But there was something in his posture, a tilt of the head, a faint smirk that hinted at arrogance. As his gaze settled on Ava, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of judgment passing through them. "First class?" the gate agent asked, his voice a shaky whisper, as if he doubted the words even as he spoke them. "Yes," Ava replied, her tone smooth and unwavering. Though she felt the familiar sting of that hesitation, it wasn't new to her, this pause, this subtle questioning of her right to be where she stood. She'd faced it before, in boardrooms and boutiques, in places where her presence seemed to unsettle unspoken rules. But Ava had long ago mastered the art of composure. Her dignity was her shield, forged through years of navigating a world that too often tried to diminish her. The agent scanned her ticket, his movements quick and mechanical, ready to let her pass, when Blake's hand shot out, pressing firmly against the counter to halt the process. "Excuse me," Blake said, his voice thick with a condescension that made Ava's skin prickle. "Mum, are you sure you're at the right gate?" His tone dripped with mockery, each word carefully chosen to undermine her. Ava turned to face him, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that belied her calm exterior. "Quite sure," she answered, her voice steady as steel, refusing to bend under his scrutiny. Blake let out a low chuckle, a grating sound that scraped against the hum of the terminal like a jagged edge. "It's just unusual," he said, his words trailing off into a heavy silence. "We don't often see first-class passengers." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung there, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the air like a blade. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience tested but unbroken. She'd heard this tune before, the same tired notes of prejudice dressed up as curiosity. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" she asked, her voice cool and precise, daring him to say what lingered beneath his smug facade. The gate agent shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Ava and Blake, caught in the crossfire of a confrontation he hadn't signed up for. But Blake didn't flinch. "I'd just like to verify a few things before we allow you to board," he said, his eyes glinting with something darker, something that wasn't just suspicion, but a perverse satisfaction in wielding his power. Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression a mask of calm. "You're the pilot, not security," she pointed out, her words sharp yet measured. "Our ticket checks part of your duties now." Blake's smirk widened, clearly relishing the small audience that had begun to gather, passengers pausing mid-stride, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. "Let's just say I like to ensure everything runs smoothly on my flights," he replied, his tone oozing with false sincerity. "Protocol, you know." The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, a mix of unease and indifference rippling through them. Some cast furtive glances at Ava, while others turned away, unwilling to wade into the tension thickening the air. Ava felt their stares, a heavy weight pressing against her chest, but she stood taller, her resolve unshaken. "If there's a problem," she said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the chatter, "I'd like to know what it is." Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me board. Blake's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, but he quickly doubled down. Security concerns, he said vaguely, waving a hand as if that explained everything. We've had some incidents lately. You understand, I'm sure. Ava's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking deep within her. But she refused to let it show. She knew this Gamek knew he wanted her to crack, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Instead, she reached into her bag with deliberate calm, pulling out her phone. I'll contact my husband, she said simply, her voice a quiet promise. Blake lafayette a sharp, mocking bark that echoed off the walls. Oh, by all means, he sneered, but I'm afraid no phone call's going to change the rules. Ava raised an eyebrow, her silence more cutting than any retort. She dialed David's number, her fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside her, and waited as the line connected. David, she said when he answered, her voice firm but edged with a quiet urgency. I need you at gate 14. Now. Blake's smirk stretched wider, his confidence unshaken. No one's coming to save you, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, his words dripping with disdain. But Ava didn't flinch. She slipped her phone back into her bag and stepped aside, her posture a fortress of poise. I'll wait, she said, her voice a calm declaration that carried more weight than his bluster. The minutes stretched on, the tension at the gate thickening like fog. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. A young mother nearby clutched her toddler's hand, her brow furrowed as she watched Ava with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. An older man in a rumpled suit shook his head, muttering something about overreach to his wife, who nodded silently. Ava stood apart, her gaze fixed on the terminal entrance, her thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and resolve. She wouldn't give Blake the satisfaction of seeing her falter, not now, not ever. Then, the air shifted. David Robinson strode into view, his presence like a thunderclap in the crowded terminal. Tall and imposing, his tailored suit hugged his broad frame, every step radiating purpose. The crowd parted instinctively, drawn back by the quiet authority he exuded. His dark eyes scanned the scene, landing on Ava with a fierce protectiveness that softened for just a moment before hardening. As they shifted to Blake, the pilot still lounged against the counter, oblivious to the storm approaching, his smirk intact. David's arrival silenced the murmurs, the onlookers holding their breath as he closed the distance to the gate. Ava stepped forward to meet him, her voice steady, but laced with a relief she kept tightly reined. David, she said, and though she'd never admit it, his presence was a life-alinea shield against the indignity she'd endured. He saw it instantly, the tension in her shoulders, the faint clench of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped her bag a little too tightly. A surge of fury roared through him, not at her, but at the man who had dared to strip her of the respect she deserved. His gaze flicked to Blake, who straightened slightly, still unaware of the shift in power. I'd like an explanation, David said to the gate agent first, his voice low and commanding, as to why my wife is being prevented from boarding her flight. The young agent stammered, his face paling as he glanced at Blake for rescue. The captain stepped forward, his confidence unshaken. I'm ensuring the safety of my passengers, Blake said smoothly, his tone polished but hollow. Your wife raised some concerns. David's brow furrowed, his patience fraying. Concerns, he repeated, his voice sharpening. What concerns? She presented a valid ticket. Didn't she? Blake hesitated, a crack in his armor, but he pressed on. Well, yes, he admitted, but I have the authority to make decisions regarding passenger safety. David's voice dropped to a dangerous calm, each word a dagger. And what exactly about my wife makes her a safety concern? Blake's smugness wavered, but he rallied with a patronizing smile. I don't have to justify my decisions to you, he said, folding his arms. David took a step closer, his presence towering over the pilot. You do now, he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. The crowd leaned in, the air crackling with anticipation. Blake's irritation flared, his composure slipping. And who exactly do you think you are to demand that? He snapped. David Robinson, came the even reply, owner of this airline. The terminal seemed to freeze. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, the gate agent's face draining of color as if he might faint. Blake's smirk vanished, his mouth falling open in stunned silence. David didn't relent. "Your actions today have not only humiliated my wife," he said, his voice rising with controlled fury, "but have jeopardized the integrity of this company. I demand a full explanation. Right now." Blake stammered, his arrogance crumbling like dry clay. Tu was just following protocol. He managed, the excuse ringing hollow even to him. "Do not insult my intelligence by hiding behind protocol," David cut in, his words slicing through the air. "This is about prejudice, plain and simple, and it ends here." Blake's face flushed, his bravado evaporating. "Sir, I was only trying to," he began, but David silenced him. "You were trying to assert your superiority over a paying passenger over my wife. I will not tolerate it." Ava, silent until now, watched the exchange with a quiet strength, her presence a testament to the justice unfolding. In that moment, the lesson was clear: power misused carries a price, and those who wield it unjustly will face the consequences. When the scales tipped back toward righteousness, as she stepped forward, her voice flowed with a serene authority, a quiet strength that drowned out even the faint, quivering objections spilling from Captain Blake's lips. "I've crossed paths with men like you before," she declared, her words deliberate, heavy with experience. "You wear your title like a crown, believing it grants you the right to trample over anyone in your way. But today, Captain, you've misjudged your target." Her gaze bore into him unyielding, as if peeling back the layers of his bravado to expose the fragility beneath. Blake's eyes darted nervously between her and the man standing beside her, his once sturdy confidence crumbling like dry earth underfoot. "It was just a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice a thin, trembling thread, barely holding together under the weight of their scrutiny. David's stare was a blade of ice, cutting through Blake's feeble defense. "The only misunderstanding," he said, his tone low and deliberate, "is your belief that your actions would slip by unnoticed, free of consequence." A hush fell over the crowded gate area, the air thick with tension as passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Blake's face twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water. "You can't be serious," he sputtered, his voice rising in pitch, desperation seeping through the cracks of his composure. "I've served this airline for over a decade." David's response came swift and unrelenting, a quiet storm building in his words. "And in those 10 years, how many others have you crushed beneath your heel? How many have you humiliated, dismissed, or silenced? All because you thought your uniform made you untouchable." There was no room for argument in his voice, only the sharp edge of finality. "Your time in that uniform ends here, today." Moments later, the sharp clack of boots echoed across the tiled floor as security officers arrived, summoned by the gate staff, who now stood frozen, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and awe. The officers approached Blake with practiced precision, their expressions blank, their movements mechanical. Blake's protests erupted into a frantic crescendo, his arms flailing as he tried to wrench himself free from their grasp. "This is outrageous. You can't do this to me," he shouted, his voice cracking with indignation. But David raised a hand, a single, commanding gesture that silenced the chaos. "Escort him off the premises," he instructed, his tone as steady as stone, "and see to it that his access credentials are stripped immediately." The officers nodded, their efficiency unwavering as they tightened their hold on Blake, dragging him away. His shouts grew fainter, swallowed by the hum of the bustling airport, until they vanished entirely. A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the onlookers, a wave of shock giving way to tentative applause that scattered through the crowd, like leaves caught in a breeze. David turned to Ava, his stern features softening as concern flickered in his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice dropping to a gentle murmur meant only for her ears. Ava met his gaze with a faint, unshaken smile, her poise a fortress against the storm that had just passed. "I am now," she replied, her words carrying a quiet resilience. David gave a small nod, then shifted his attention to the gate agent, a young man whose hands trembled as he clutched a clipboard, his wide eyes darting nervously between the couple. "Ensure my wife boards first," David said, his tone firm yet laced with an unspoken promise of care. And see that she's treated with every courtesy." The agent fumbled with Ava's boarding pass, his shaky fingers nearly dropping it as he stammered, "Right away, Mr. Robinson. Mrs. Robinson, please, this way." Ava moved toward the boarding tunnel with measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the floor, while David lingered behind, his sharp gaze sweeping over the remaining staff and passengers. It was a silent challenge, a dare for anyone to question the justice that had just unfolded. Satisfied that order had been restored, he turned and followed her, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the crowd. As they settled into the plush leather seats of first class, the cushions cradled Ava's weary frame, offering a fleeting sense of comfort. Yet her mind churned restlessly, unable to settle. She adjusted the silk scarf draped around her neck, her fingers brushing the fabric as she leaned back, her eyes locking onto the window. Beyond the glass, the runway unfurled beneath the warm, golden glow of the setting, soon a scene of serene beauty that clashed starkly with the tempest of emotions still swirling within her. The soft shuffle of footsteps broke her reverie, and she turned to see a flight attendant approaching, her posture stiff with unease. The woman's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her fingers twisting nervously as she spoke. "Mrs. Robinson," she began, her voice trembling with a blend of deference and guilt. "On behalf of the crew, I want to offer our deepest apologies for what you endured earlier. It was utterly unacceptable." Ava's gaze shifted to meet hers, her expression a mask of cool detachment, betraying none of the lingering sting she felt. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone measured, polite but distant. She had no desire to unpack her feelings for this stranger. The weight of the earlier humiliation still pressed against her chest, a bruise she wasn't ready to reveal. The attendant nodded hastily, retreating with an awkward bob of her head, leaving Ava alone with her thoughts once more. David slid into the seat beside her, his movements deliberate yet quieter than usual, as if he, too, carried the echoes of the day's turmoil. His face, typically a portrait of calm authority, bore faint lines of strain, a subtle reminder of how quickly control had slipped from their grasp. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative, as though he feared her answer might unravel him. Ava glanced at him, the ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. "I am," she said softly, then tilted her head, studying him. "But you don't look like you are." He sighed, dragging a hand through his neatly combed hair, the gesture betraying a rare flicker of vulnerability. "I can't stop thinking about it," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. How many others has he treated like that? How many people had no one to stand up for them? Ava's expression softened, a quiet understanding passing between them. "It's not the first time I've faced someone like Blake," she admitted, her tone tinged with weary familiarity, "and I doubt it'll be the last. But today was different." David leaned closer, his brow furrowing with concern. "How so?" Ava turned back to the window, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she gathered her thoughts. "It wasn't just what he said, David. It was the way he looked at me, like I was an intruder, like I had no right to be there. No matter how much I've fought to earn my place." Her words hung in the air, sharp and raw, slicing through the silence. David's jaw clenched, a storm of anger flashing in his eyes at the thought of her enduring such indignity, and worse, the realization that these wounds were not new, that she'd carried them longer than he'd known. "I should have been there sooner," he said, his voice thick with self-reproach. "I should have." Ava cut him off, her tone firm yet gentle as she reached for his hand, her touch a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of guilt. "You were there when it mattered," she said, her dark eyes locking with his. "That's what counts." Her warmth steadied him, and he exhaled slowly, nodding as the tension in his shoulders eased. "You're right," he conceded, though a spark of resolve flared in his gaze. "But I won't let this go. Blake's behavior isn't just about you, it's about the system that shielded him. The arrogance he thought would protect him from consequences." Ava met his stare, her expression steady and thoughtful. "Then let's change it," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever stood where I did." A faint smile broke across David's face, pride glinting in his eyes. "We will," he promised, his tone unwavering. "Starting with a full overhaul of the airline's policies, and I want you to lead it." Ava blinked, caught off guard by the weight of his words. "Me?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "You," David confirmed, his certainty unshakable. "No one understands what's at stake better than you. You've lived it, Ava. You can make sure no one else has too." For a moment, she said nothing, her mind racing as she weighed the enormity of the task. Then, slowly, she nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. "If it means making a difference, I'll do it," she said, her voice firm with purpose. David squeezed her hand gently, a gesture of trust and solidarity. "You always do," he murmured, his tone soft but filled with conviction. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent takeoff, and the couple settled into their seats as the plane's engines roared to life. The aircraft surged down the runway, lifting into the sky as the cabin lights dimmed, the world below shrinking into a distant blur. Ava closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines wash over her, soothing the frayed edges of her nerves. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of peace, knowing that the wheels of change were already turning. Yet as the plane climbed higher, a single thought lingered in her mind. Captain Blake might be gone, but the deeper battle for justice and equality stretched far beyond him, and she was ready to lead the charge. The next morning, sunlight poured through the towering windows of David and Ava Robinson's penthouse apartment, bathing the sleek marble floors in a warm, golden glow. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, a breathtaking panorama of glass and steel, but neither of them spared it a glance. Ava sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open before her, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She scrolled through an email from David's legal team. The words stark and unequivocal. Captain Matthew Blake's termination was official, his dismissal a swift execution of the airline's zero-tolerance policy on discrimination. The language was cold, precise, a legal guillotine that left no room for appeal. Yet as she read, her brow furrowed, her thoughts drifting beyond the screen to the broader implications of what had happened. David entered the room, his crisp suit jacket slung over one arm as he fastened his cufflinks. Preparing for a day of meetings, he paused mid-step, his sharp eyes catching the tension in Ava's posture with a slight hunch of her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her mug. "Still thinking about yesterday?" he asked, crossing to the counter to pour himself a cup of coffee. Ava looked up, her expression pensive, a storm of thoughts brewing behind her calm exterior. "It's not just about yesterday," she said, her voice measured but laced with intensity. "It's about everything it stands for." Blake wasn't the root of the problem, was a symptom, a product of something much uglier, much deeper. David nodded, leaning against the counter as he stirred his coffee, his gaze steady on her. "You're right," he agreed. "That's why we're not stopping with him. We're going to dismantle the culture that let him thrive, that turned a blind eye to his abuse of power." Ava closed her laptop with a soft click, turning to face him fully, her dark eyes alight with determination. "I've been thinking about what you said on the plane," she began, her words deliberate, "about me leading the effort to change things." David tilted his head, encouraging her to continue, his expression unwavering, and he prompted. "I want to do it," she said, her voice ringing with resolve, "but not just as a figurehead. If I'm taking this on, I want full control of every decision, every step." A faint smile tugged at David's lips, a glimmer of admiration shining through. "Done," he said without hesitation, his tone as solid as a vow. "Whatever you need, resources, staff, authority, it's yours." Ava returned his smile, though her mind was already racing, spinning with ideas and possibilities. "It's not just about rewriting policies," she said, her voice gaining momentum. "We need to shift mindsets. That means mandatory training, real accountability, and a system where employees can speak up without fear of being crushed in retaliation." David raised an eyebrow, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his lips. "That sounds like a complete overhaul," he said, his tone a mix of curiosity and respect. "It is," Ava replied, her gaze unwavering. "Justice isn't just about punishing the Blakes of the world, it's about building something better, something that doesn't let power corrupt in the first place. And if we do this right, the lesson will echo far beyond one airline." David set his cup down, crossing his arms as he studied her, the weight of her vision settling over him. "You're not just talking about consequences," he said slowly. "You're talking about rewriting the rules." Ava nodded, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Exactly. Power without accountability breeds arrogance. We've seen the cost yesterday was proof. Now it's time to show what happens when that arrogance meets its reckoning." The air in the conference room hung thick with tension, the sleek glass walls and spars, modern decor amplifying the sense of exposure. It felt less like a meeting space and more like a stage where every gesture, every word, would be scrutinized. The airline's executive team sat around the polished table, their faces a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, waiting for Ava to break the silence. She stood at the head, her posture unwavering, exuding a quiet authority that belied the storm of emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. Her dark suit was crisp, her expression resolute, and when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the stillness like a blade, steady, deliberate, and unyielding. "Let me be clear from the outset," Ava began, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of restrained frustration. "What happened yesterday wasn't some fluke, some unfortunate blip we can brush aside. It was a glaring symptom of deeper, systemic failures we've let fester for far too long." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Several executives shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable, fingers tapping nervously on the table, eyes darting to avoid her piercing gaze. But Ava didn't waver. She stood taller, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself as she pressed forward. "We've built a reputation on luxury and excellence, but those words are hollow if our actions don't match them. Starting today, every single person in this company from the top brass to the newest hire will participate in mandatory, comprehensive diversity and inclusion training, and I'll be the one overseeing it, ensuring it's not just talk but real, tangible change." Across the table, a middle-aged executive named Mr. Harris, his thinning hair combed meticulously to one side, cleared his throat with a skepticism he didn't bother to mask. His brows furrowed, and his lips pursed into a thin line as he leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, Mrs. Robinson," he said, his voice gravelly and tinged with condescension, "overhauling an entire company culture isn't some weekend project. It's a massive undertaking. We're talking potential disruptions, delays, costs, operational chaos." His words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in practicality. Ava turned to face him, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey the steel beneath her calm demeanor. "And with all due respect, Mr. Harris," she replied, her voice sharpening like a honed edge, "letting discrimination run rampant has already disrupted us. Yesterday wasn't just a hit to our image, it was a betrayal of the trust our customers place in us. Chaos, we're already living it, thanks to inaction." Her words landed like a thunderclap, silencing his rebuttal before it could form. Mr. Harris leaned back, his skepticism dimming under the weight of her resolve. At the far end of the table, David watched the exchange unfold, his presence quiet but steady. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, not out of amusement, but admiration. He didn't need to intervene. Eva owned the room, her authority radiating in waves. She didn't need rescuing, and he knew it. His hazel eyes followed her every move, taking in the way she commanded attention without raising her voice, the way she turned doubt into determination. Another voice broke the tension. A younger executive, a woman with sharp features and an eager posture, leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly as if anchoring herself. "What about reporting?" she asked, her tone earnest, almost urgent. "A lot of employees stay silent because they're terrified of retaliation. They don't trust the system or used to protect them." Ava's expression softened slightly, a flicker of approval crossing her face. "That's an excellent point," she said, her voice warming with encouragement. "We're rolling out an anonymous reporting system, managed by an independent third party. No internal bias, no fear of backlash, just a clear, safe channel for anyone to speak up." Murmurs of agreement hummed through the room, a tentative wave of support building among the team. Ava seized the momentum, her voice rising with conviction. "This isn't about dodging lawsuits or papering over bad headlines. It's about justice, about doing what's right, not just what's convenient. And if anyone here can't get behind that, there's the door. You're welcome to walk through it." The room fell into a heavy silence, No one moved. The weight of her words settled over them. A call to accountability that left no room for evasion. The meeting adjourned shortly after, but the echoes of her resolve lingered in the air. Later, David found Ava in her new office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the bustling airport below. She sat at her desk, poring over a stack of notes scribbled in her precise handwriting, her brow furrowed in concentration. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression a blend of awe and curiosity. "You didn't pull any punches in there," he said, his voice low and warm. Ava glanced up, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she set her pen down. "I didn't need to," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "If they're serious about this, they'll step up. If not, they'll show themselves out." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a spark in her eyes, a quiet confidence that lit up the room. David stepped inside, settling into the chair across from her. "You're incredible, you know that," he said, his voice softening with sincerity. "Watching you today, it reminded me why I fell for you." Ava arched an eyebrow, her smile widening playfully. "Flattery won't get you out of dinner tonight," she teased, though her gaze held a tenderness that mirrored his own. He chuckled, the day's tension easing from his shoulders. "It's not flattery, it's the truth. You don't just point out what's wrong, you fix it. And you do it with this grace, this strength that's all your own." Ava leaned back, her expression softening as she absorbed his words. "And what's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now, inviting him to elaborate. David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It means you see the mess than justice. The floss end, you don't flinch. You tackle it head on, and you make everyone around you better for it." He reached across the desk, his hand finding hers. "I'm just lucky I get to stand beside you while you do it." She squeezed his hand gently, her resolve deepening in the warmth of his support. "I couldn't do it without you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." "You don't need me to," David countered, his grip firm but reassuring. "But I'll always be here, backing you up." Together, they were a forcey and unshakable partnership ready to reshape not just their airline, but an entire industry plagued by complacency. And this was only the beginning. A month later, the airline buzzed with a cautious optimism. Ava's diversity and inclusion initiative had taken root, policies rewritten, training sessions in full swing, the anonymous reporting system humming with activity. She threw herself into every detail, her energy relentless, her focus razor-sharp. Late nights blurred into early mornings as she reviewed progress reports, met with facilitators, and fine-tuned the program. Yet beneath her tireless dedication, she carried a quiet awareness. True change wouldn't be proven in spreadsheets or training rooms. It would be forged in the crucible of crisis. That test came on a crisp morning, the kind where the air felt charged with possibility. Ava was in her office, sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across her desk. She was deep into the latest employee survey data, her pen scratching notes in the margins, when her assistant burst in, without knocking, a rare breach of protocol. The young woman's face was ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched a tablet. "Mrs. Robinson," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "we've got a situation." Ava set her pen down, her full attention snapping to the assistant. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone calm but commanding. The assistant handed her the tablet, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It's gate 27. There's an incident, you need to see this." Ava's eyes flicked to the screen, where a live feed from the security cameras painted a scene that hit her like a punch to the gut. A black man in a tailored business suit stood at the gate, his posture composed despite the tension radiating from him. Opposite him, an irate gate agent, Claire. A young woman with a pinched expression gestured defensively, her voice inaudible but her agitation clear. A small crowd had begun to gather, their murmurs a low hum of confusion and curiosity. Ava's chest tightened, a flood of memories crashing over her own moments of indignity. The sting of being judged not for who she was, but for how others perceived her. She forced the emotions down, locking them away. This wasn't about her past. It was about the man on that screen, about ensuring no one else endured what she had. She stood abruptly, grabbing her blazer from the back of her chair. "Get David on the line," she instructed, her voice clipped. Tell him what's happening, and have security meet me at the gate." By the time Ava arrived, the crowd had thickened, a sea of faces whispering and craning for a better view. She cut through them with purpose, her heels striking the polished floor in a rhythm that echoed her determination. Security trailed close behind, their presence a silent reinforcement of her authority. Claire was mid-sentence, her voice rising in pitch when she caught sight of Ava. The color drained from her face, her words faltering into a stammer. "Mrs. Robinsoni didn't realize you'd—" Ava raised a hand, cutting her off with a gesture as sharp as her tone. "What's happening here?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with an edge that demanded answers. The passenger stepped forward, his briefcase clutched in one hand, his demeanor calm but his eyes burning with quiet frustration. "I'm Mr. Carter," he said, his voice even despite the strain beneath it. "I was told my ticket needed further verification, even though I showed my ID and confirmation number. No explanation, just delays and suspicion." Ava turned to Claire, her gaze piercing through the younger woman's defenses. "Is that true?" she asked, her words measured but unrelenting. Claire hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor as if it might swallow her whole. "I thought his ticket might be fraudulent," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "We're trained to watch for suspicious activity, and I just—" Ava's voice hardened, cutting through the excuse like a blade. "And what, exactly, about Mr. Carter's ticket or his apparent struck you as suspicious?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it, her silence a damning admission. "Mr. Carter folded his arms, his frustration spilling over. "I've flown with this airline for years," he said, his tone sharp with exasperation. "Never a problem. But today, I'm treated like a criminal." "Why?" Ava turned to him, her expression softening with genuine regret. "Mr. Carter, I am so sorry for what you've been put through," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her sincerity. "This is unacceptable. It's the opposite of everything we're trying to build here." She glanced back at Claire, whose desperation broke through in a shaky plea. "I didn't mean any harm, Mrs. Robinsoni, swear." "Harm was done," Ava snapped, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Mr. Carter was humiliated in front of a crowd because of your assumptions. That's what we're working to eradicate." She gestured to a nearby supervisor, a middle-aged man hovering anxiously at the edge of the scene. "Take Mr. Carter to first class," she instructed. "Make sure he's comfortable and compensated for this ordeal." The supervisor nodded, offering Mr. Carter a quiet apology as he guided him toward the boarding tunnel. Ava turned back to Claire, who stood trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. "Claire," she began, her voice firm but tempered with a hint of compassion, "I know unconscious bias can cloud judgment. That's why we've put training and policies in place to catch this before it happens. But you've been through those sessions. You should have known better." Claire's voice quivered as she nodded. "I've attended, Mrs. Robinson. I thought I was doing my job." Ava sighed, her expression softening just enough to show she wasn't blind to the girl's distress. "Mistakes happen, but accountability matters. I'll review this with HR. You'll need additional training, and for now, you're suspended pending an investigation." Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks, but she whispered, "I understand," before stepping aside, her shoulders slumping in defeat. That evening, Ava and David sat in their living room, the fireplace casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors. Ava recounted the day's events, her voice steady but tinged with a weariness that spoke to the emotional toll. She sank into the plush sofa, her hands resting in her lap as she stared into the flickering flames. "It's progress," she said softly, "but it's also a reminder of how much work is left." Claire didn't act out of it, she acted out of ignorance, and that's a harder beast to slay. David sat beside her, his presence a quiet anchor. "You handled it perfectly," he said, his tone warm and reassuring. "This is why you're the one leading this charge." She leaned back, her thoughts drifting as the firelight danced across her face. "I hope it's enough," she murmured, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time. "It will be," David said with quiet certainty, reaching for her hand. "Because you won't stop until it is." His fingers laced through hers, grounding her as the night deepened around them. In that moment, Ava felt the ember of her resolve flare. Anyush wasn't just fighting for an airline, but for a deeper justice, a reckoning for every abuse of power left unchecked. And with David by her side, she knew she'd see it through, no matter the cost. At gate 27, the passenger stood tall despite the sting of indignity, his clenched fists and tight jaw revealing a storm of frustration brewing within him. His resilience in the face of such adversity struck a deep chord in Ava, stirring her emotions and reigniting her sense of purpose. This wasn't merely about smoothing over a single airline mishap. It was about dismantling a deeply entrenched culture of apathy and prejudice, one painstaking struggle at a time. That moment lingered in her mind, a vivid reminder that justice wasn't a gift bestowed lightly. It was a hard-won prize that demanded unwavering resolve. The following week, Ava strode into the airline's headquarters, her steps echoing with quiet elegance across the polished marble floors. Yet beneath her composed exterior burned a fierce determination, a fire flickering in her dark eyes that no one could ignore. The incident at Gate 27 had sent shockwaves through the company, sparking heated debates that rippled from the break rooms to the boardroom. Some employees whispered their support in hushed tones, while others grumbled about the upheaval she was causing. Ava understood that true transformation never arrived without pushback. It was a gritty, uphill battle she was prepared to fight. She entered the executive boardroom, a vast space where sleek glass walls framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, stretching into the horizon. The air inside was thick, heavy with unspoken tension as the board members filed in, their polished shoes clicking against the floor. Some greeted her with curt nods, their faces betraying a flicker of respect, while others stared intently at their notes, avoiding her piercing gaze. At the head of the table sat David, his presence a steady anchor amid the brewing storm. His calm authority was a shield, though today it felt more like a dam holding back the flood of dissent threatening to spill over. "Thank you all for being here," David began, his voice smooth yet resolute, cutting through the room's unease like a blade. "We've made remarkable progress with our diversity and inclusion initiative, but recent events like what unfolded at Gate 27 show us we're far from finished." His words hung in the air, a call to action wrapped in quiet strength. Ava rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her eyes sweeping across the room like a hawk surveying its territory. "That incident wasn't an isolated blunder," she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of steel. "It was a glaring spotlight on the biases we're still wrestling with. Policies on paper mean nothing if they're not lived out in practicing. That begins with us. Right here, in this room." Her words landed with weight, a challenge to the comfortable status quo. Richard, a board member in his 50s with silver streaks in his hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished table. His expression was one of practiced skepticism, a thin smile masking his unease. "Mrs. Robinson, I don't disagree that inclusivity matters," he said, his tone measured but dripping with condescension. "But these changes are throwing our operations into chaos. The extra training sessions are piling stress on our staff, and frankly, some think we're going overboard." Ava locked eyes with him, unflinching, her posture rigid with resolve. "Overboard?" she echoed, letting the word linger like a bitter taste. "I'd say what's truly overboard is letting discrimination fester unchecked, because it's easier to look the other way. If our employees are overwhelmed, maybe it's because we're finally dragging decades of neglect into the light. That's not a burden, it's a reckoning." From the far end of the table, Julia, a younger board member with sharp features and a restless energy, cleared her throat. "I get why we need this shift," she said, her voice tentative but gaining strength. "But senior staff are uneasy about the anonymous reporting system. They're worried it's a Pandora's box. False claims could ruin careers." Ava nodded, acknowledging the concern with a tilt of her head. "That's a fair point, Julia," she replied, her tone softening slightly. "We've built checks into the process. Every report gets a thorough review before we act. It's not flawless, but it's a start toward accountability. And accountability isn't something we can compromise on, not when trust is at stake." Richard shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the table in a restless rhythm. "Mrs. Robinson, you're asking us to rip apart practices that have held strong for decades. That kind of overhaul doesn't happen in a blink. No, it doesn't, Ava shot back, her voice sharpening like a blade honed on stone. But sitting idle isn't an option either. Every day we hesitate. Someone else endures what I did or worse. Justice delayed is justice denied, and I'm not here to play it safe. Her words crackled with urgency, a fire fueled by personal stakes. Richard opened his mouth, his face reddening, but David's voice sliced through the rising heat. Ava's right, he said, his tone firm yet measured, a steady hand on the reins. This isn't about keeping things cozy, it's about forging a company and a culture we can stand behind. Ava glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude softening her steely resolve. Then she turned back to the room, her voice steady but laced with raw honesty. I know this rattles some of you. Change always does. But ask yourselves, do we want to be the airline scrambling to mop up scandals after they explode? Or do we want to lead the charge in stopping them before they start? Her question hung there, heavy and unyielding, a mirror held up to their collective conscience. Silence swallowed the room, her words sinking into the cracks of doubt and defiance. Julia broke the stillness, her voice now firm with newfound conviction. Mrs. Robinson's hitting the nail on the head. We can't afford to stagnate in it if we want the best people working here or customers trusting us. This isn't just optics, it's survival. Richard's frown deepened, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he held his tongue. Ava cataloged Julia's support in her Minda's small but vital crack in the wall of resistance she'd expected to face. The meeting adjourned, and Ava retreated to her office, the weight of the confrontation settling into her bones. David followed a moment later, easing the door shut behind him and leaning against it with a faint, knowing smile. You were a force in there, he said, his voice warm with admiration. Even Richard didn't know how to counter you. Ava sank into her chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It's draining, she confessed, her guard slipping just enough to reveal the toll it took. Convincing people that fairness isn't a luxury, it's the bedrock of what we should be. David crossed the room, resting a hand on her shoulder, his touch a quiet reassurance. You're not just persuading them, Ava, you're rewiring how they think. That's tougher, but it's the real win. She looked up at him, her resolve wavering into something softer, more fragile. What if it's not enough? She murmured, the question slipping out like a confession. What if they dig into deep? David crouched to her level, his steady gaze locking with hers. You've moved mountains in months more than most do in a lifetime. But push back? It's proof you're shaking the right foundations. A slow nod steadied her, the embers of her determination flaring anew. Then I'll keep shaking, she said, her voice firming, no matter how long it takes. David's smile widened, his belief in her a rock she could lean on. I never doubted you would. As dusk painted the sky outside in hues of amber and violet, Ava's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen, then answered. Mrs. Robinson, came a deep, unfamiliar voice, gravelly yet warm. This is she, Ava replied, her tone cautious, senses sharpening. My name's Anthony Carter, the man continued, a faint tremor of emotion threading his words. You might not recall me, but I was the passenger at gate 27 last week. Ava straightened, the memory snapping into focused man's weathered face, the quiet dignity he'd clung to amidst the storm. Of course I remember, Mr. Carter. How can I assist you? I just needed to say thank you, he said, his voice thick with sincerity. Not just for stepping in that day, but for everything you're fighting for. I've flown with plenty of airlines, and I've never seen anyone take this stuff to heart like you do. A lump rose in Ava's throat, her composure faltering under the weight of his words. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she managed, her voice soft but genuine. That means more than you can imagine. You're changing things, he pressed on, a spark of conviction in his tone. And if there's ever a way I can back you up, just say the word. A smile broke through her fatigue, a flicker of hope lighting her weary spirit. I'll hold you to that, she said, a quiet promise sealing the moment. As the call ended, Ava leaned back, the day's burdens lifting just enough to let her breathe. The war wasn't won, but these fleeting victoriousmo as they seemed were the fuel that kept her going. She wasn't just rewriting rules, she was rewriting lives, and that truth anchored her soul. Months rolled by, and Ava's crusade began to ripple beyond her airline, sending waves through an industry long steeped in tradition. Articles in glossy magazines hailed her as a trailblazer, while employees who'd once shrunk from speaking out now stood taller, their voices emboldened. Yet every triumph brought fresh hurdles, new skeptics to sway, new battles to wage. For Ava, the finish line was a mirage, always shifting, but she pressed on, fueled by the belief that change wasn't optional, it was inevitable. Her resolve earned her an invitation to a global aviation summit, a prestigious gathering of industry titanios in tailored suits, executives with sharp eyes, and policymakers wielding influence like a blade. Her keynote address was the event's crown jewel, and she felt the gravity of every step as she climbed the stage. The spotlight bathed her in a stark glow, but her voice rang out clear and unshaken. "Diversity isn't some trendy catchphrase," she began, her words cutting through the hum of the crowd. "It's the lifeblood of progress, of growth, of trust. For too long, silent biases have choked our industry, strangling innovation and pushing people away. It's time we rip those barriers down, brick by brick." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that thundered through the hall. But the real triumph came later, as rival airline leaders approached her, their guarded curiosity giving way to genuine questions. "How do we start this at our companies?" they asked, notebooks in hand. Ava shared her roadmap freely, her vision to vast to hoard. This wasn't about one airline's glory, it was about lifting an entire field into the light. Soon after, a call from the Secretary of Transportation jolted her. Impressed by her tenacity, they offered her a seat on a federal task force to tackle discrimination across trains, planes, and highways. It was a mantle she hadn't sought, but one she couldn't turn away. David's eyes shone with pride when she told him, "This isn't just our airline's fight anymore," he said, his voice rich with certainty. "You're setting the bar for the whole damn country." With his unwavering support, Ava stepped into the role, her voice now echoing on a national stage. Meanwhile, Captain Matthew Blake, the man whose actions at Gate 27 had sparked this fire, faced a reckoning of his own. His firing was just the beginning. A passenger advocacy group dug into his past, unearthing a trail of complaints that painted a damning picture. Barred from other airlines, Blake lashed back, filing a wrongful termination suit against Ava's company. The case ignited a media frenzy, drawing battle lines in the public eye. Supporters rallied behind Ava, seeing her as a beacon of accountability, while Blake's defenders clung to outdated notions of unchecked power. In the courtroom, Ava took the stand, her words a blend of precision and passion. "This isn't about one man's job," she said, her gaze sweeping the jury. "It's about making sure every person, regardless of who they are, can board a plane without dread or shame. Power without consequence breeds tyranny, and that stops here." The gavel fell in the airline's favor, Blake's case crumbling under the weight of evidence and principle. It was more than a win, it was a clarion call. Abuse power, and justice will find you. Through it all, Ava and David grew closer, their shared mission weaving a tighter bond. Late nights at home became their sanctuary, the kitchen table strewn with notes as they dreamed up strategies and traced the arc of their journey. On the first anniversary of her initiative, David raised a glass, his voice thick with emotion. "To my wife," he said, "for proving change isn't a pipe dream, it's a force you can't stop." Ava's smile was weary but radiant. "And to you," she replied, "for being my rock every brutal step of the way." Years later, Ava's fingerprints were etched into the industry's soul. Her policies became blueprints, her leadership a spark for women and minorities chasing aviation dreams. At a graduation for the company's training program, dubbed the Robinson Initiative, she stood beside David, watching new hires in crisp uniforms take their oaths. Pride swelled in her chest, mingling with the scars of a fight that had tested her to her core. What began as a moment of humiliation at Gate 27 had birthed a movement, not just for her, but for countless others. As applause washed over her, Ava knew the struggle for justice wasn't over, but the roots she'd planted would stretch far beyond her, a living testament to the cost and triumph of standing firm.